All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into something that I think a lot of people are really interested in, which is, uh, you know, stress testing a risk portfolio, and specifically using Monte Carlo simulation.
Mhm.
And I think this is going to be really helpful for folks who are maybe involved in risk in their day-to-day, or if they're looking at it from
Mhm.
like a wider company perspective, or maybe just, trying to level up their business acumen in general.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig into this today.
So what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is to really unpack how Monte Carlo simulation can help us kind of go beyond just looking at individual risks, one at a time.
Mm.
And instead start think about like, okay, what are the potential worst case scenarios for our entire collection of risks?
Right.
Like our portfolio as a whole.
Yeah, that portfolio view is so crucial and often overlooked.
Right, exactly. And we want to do this, in a way that makes sense. We don't want to get too lost in the weeds, but I think it's something that, if you can grasp this, I think it can really unlock a whole different level of understanding about how risk works.
Absolutely. It's about gaining that deeper insight without getting bogged down by the technical jargon.
Totally. So I guess like the place to start is like, what is Monte Carlo simulation, right?
Mhm.
Like at a basic level, it's basically a way for us to kind of, try to understand how much uncertainty is baked into like all of our assumptions.
Right. Yeah, it's a powerful tool for embracing that uncertainty and seeing how it can play out.
Like, imagine you're trying to, figure out how much a project is going to cost,
Yeah.
but there's like all this stuff you don't know. Like, material prices could fluctuate, labor costs, things happen, potential delays, you name it. So instead of just like using your best guess, picking one number, Monte Carlo is basically like it runs a whole bunch of simulations, right? Like thousands.
Thousands, yeah.
Yeah.
It's simulating all those different possibilities.
Right. And each one is like slightly different. Like it picks random values for those things we were talking about, but like within a reasonable range.
It's not just picking anything out of thin air. It's based on the probabilities and ranges we define.
And like what's so cool about this is it gives you like instead of one answer, it
Mhm.
gives you this whole range of possible costs. And it could be anything from like super optimistic to, pretty darn pessimistic.
It really helps you understand the full spectrum of potential outcomes,
Yeah.
which is crucial for risk management.
And, this whole approach is super helpful for risk quantification. Because it helps us, come up with these things called, what are they, loss exceedance curves.
Loss exceedance curves.
Yeah, and those are basically like, visual ways to see like, okay, what's the probability that, our losses are going to exceed certain levels? Like, that's really what we care about at the end of the day.
Exactly. It's about understanding that tail risk, those extreme scenarios that could really hurt us.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Like, the way we apply this Monte Carlo thing, it's like night and day when you're talking about individual risks versus like your entire portfolio. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on today.
It's a distinction that's so important because it can drastically change our understanding of our overall risk exposure.
Yeah, like the simple way to think about portfolio risk,
Sure.
the way maybe a lot of people do it, is you just kind of look at each risk separately, right? Like build a little model for cyber risk, a little model for market risk,
Yeah.
operational risk, whatever it is.
Yeah, you break it down into its component parts, which seems logical at first.
Right. And you get all these different numbers and then you kind of just try to add them all together and you're like, okay, that's my total risk.
Right.
Like it makes sense on the surface.
Right, it's a very linear way of thinking about it, and it can be misleading.
So here's where Monte Carlo kind of shakes things up. Instead of doing it piecemeal, you actually run the simulation on your entire portfolio, like all at once from the get-go.
It's about recognizing that those risks aren't isolated. They interact and influence each other.
And it's like you're simulating like thousands of different years,
Yeah.
For your business. And in each year, you're seeing how all these risks are kind of playing out together.
You're getting a much more dynamic and realistic picture of how those risks can combine and cascade.
Right. And by looking at like the spread, the distribution of outcomes across all those simulations, it gives you like a much richer understanding of like, what could happen. Not just like the average, but also like, the extremes.
Exactly. You're seeing the potential for both typical losses and those really significant, potentially catastrophic ones.
And that's really important because like, a lot of times we focus on like the average outcome, right? Like what's the most likely scenario? And that's useful for like, everyday decision making for sure.
It gives you a sense of what to expect in a normal year, so to speak.
But when we talk about stress testing, what we're really trying to do is like, figure out how bad things can really get right. Like What are those worst case scenarios that could really rock the boat?
It's about preparing for the unexpected, those events that could really test the resilience of your business.
And this is super critical in certain industries, right? Like
hmm
banking, for instance.
Absolutely. Regulators are increasingly focused on stress testing, particularly in areas like capital adequacy. They want to know that banks can withstand those severe shocks to the system.
And how do we even, define what the worst case is for our whole portfolio, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing to talk about it, but
Yeah.
how do you actually pinpoint it?
So one approach you can use is something called the maximum value view. And basically what this does is it tries to look across all those Monte Carlo simulations and find the absolute worst possible year, for
Yeah.
your entire portfolio. Like what's the maximum loss you could face in any single year?
So it's like you're looking for that one year where everything just kind of goes wrong.
Yeah, it paints a picture of that peak impact, the most damaging scenario across all those simulations.
Well, the thing is, there's another way to look at this, right? And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. This is what they call the element view, right?
Yeah, the element view takes a different perspective and it can be really illuminating.
So how does that work? How is that different from this whole portfolio view?
Okay, so instead of looking at the portfolio as one big thing, and trying to find its worst year, the element view, it kind of zooms in on each little piece, right? Like all those individual risks, those building blocks that make up your portfolio structure.
It's like taking a microscope to your risk landscape.
Exactly. And then for each of those individual risks, it figures out what's the absolute worst case scenario for that specific risk.
So it's not worried about whether all those worst case events happen at the same time, right?
Yeah.
It's just saying, okay, for this one risk, what's the most extreme thing that could happen?
Exactly. It's isolating that maximum potential loss for each individual risk element.
Got it.
And here's the whole part. It then takes all those individual worst cases and it adds them all up.
So it's like assuming that everything goes wrong at the same time, even though that might not be realistic.
Exactly. And this is where it gets interesting because in the example from the material we reviewed, they showed a hypothetical organization. And when they looked at the portfolio using that first approach, the aggregate view, the risk was estimated at about $3.5 billion.
Okay.
But when they switched to this element view and they just added up all the worst cases for each individual risk, that number jumped to $5.4 billion.
Whoa. That is a huge difference. So what's going on there? Why is there such a big jump?
So the key takeaway here is that if you just add up those individual risk assessments, you can really underestimate how bad things could potentially get for the whole organization.
You're missing the big picture, the interconnectedness of it all.
Exactly. And the reason is when you have a good portfolio of risks, it means you're diversified, right? And the odds of every single one of those risks experiencing its absolute worst case scenario at the same time, well, that's pretty unlikely.
It's like flipping a coin, right?
Yeah.
The odds of getting heads 10 times in a row are much lower than getting heads just once or twice.
Right. So the element view, by assuming that all those worst cases happen together, it's creating a scenario that's statistically, not very likely compared to that single worst case year we talked about earlier.
So it's like a super conservative approach, almost like a worst case of worst cases.
Exactly.
Wow.
Now, there's another view that the material touched on, and that's called the risk event view. And what's interesting about this one is it tries to pinpoint which specific risk events are really driving the overall portfolio risk.
So it's like saying, okay, we've got all these risks, but which ones are the real heavy hitters?
Right. And in the example they gave, even though, at the high level they were talking about broad enterprise risk areas, when they actually dug into the specific risk events, it turned out that client data events were the ones with the biggest potential for losses.
So even though they had all these other things they were tracking, it was data breaches, data loss that really stood out as the big one.
And then when they went a level deeper, they found that within those data events, it was specifically the loss of client data that was the main concern.
Okay.
And drilling down even further, it was the loss of investment banking client data, and especially high sensitivity investment banking client data that represented the most significant potential losses.
Wow. So it's like they started with this really broad view, and then they zoomed in until they found the specific data that would really hurt them if they lost it.
Right. And what's interesting is when they looked at the element view, where they took the worst possible outcome for each individual risk, that loss of high sensitivity investment client data risk, its calculated value stayed the same.
Even though the overall portfolio risk went way up.
Exactly. So what that tells you is that the absolute worst case year for the entire business, when you look at it as a whole, is probably going to be heavily driven by the worst case scenario for this one specific risk area.
So even though you might have, the worst possible sales quarter and the worst possible supply chain disruption and all these other things going wrong, the thing that's really going to sink the ship is losing that specific data.
That's right. And that has huge implications for how you approach risk mitigation.
Right. Because if you know that one particular risk is the real weak link, you can really focus your resources on protecting it.
If you can effectively prevent that one critical loss, it's going to have a ripple effect and dramatically improve your stress testing results and your overall capital adequacy.
So, the big takeaway here for anyone who's dealing with risk portfolios is this. When you're looking at stress test results, you really got to understand what those numbers are telling you. Are they just adding up a bunch of averages, kind of like a best guess scenario? Or are they truly reflecting the potential worst case for your whole portfolio, taking into account how all those risks can interact and potentially amplify each other?
Those two approaches can lead to very different conclusions about how much risk you're actually facing.
So for everyone listening, take a minute and think about how your organization approaches risk assessment. Are you looking at things in isolation, or are you taking that more holistic, interconnected view? And what kind of conversations are you having around these different perspectives?
Here's something to consider. Could focusing really intensely on mitigating that one risk, the one that seems to have the biggest potential impact, could that make a bigger difference than you might think in preventing the overall worst case scenario for your entire portfolio? It's a question worth exploring.
And that is the deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
See you next time.